October 20th, 1944. The beachhead at Leyte was still under fire. The landing had begun only hours earlier. Japanese resistance inland had not been fully suppressed. Snipers were active in the tree line. American infantry was still clearing positions only meters from the shoreline. The tactical situation was unfinished, unstable, and unresolved. At that moment, Douglas MacArthur made a decision. He ordered his landing craft to stop short of the beach. Not because of enemy fire, not because of obstacles, but because the water was not deep enough for the image he wanted. He waded ashore deliberately, surrounded by his staff, while photographers positioned themselves to capture every step. The scene was staged. The timing was intentional. The risk was accepted without consultation. Naval commanders offshore were not informed in advance. They were forced to divert air cover from active combat missions to protect a general standing in open water. Ground units halted their advance to form an improvised security perimeter around a photo opportunity. Combat priorities were reversed. The camera came first. This was not confusion. It was not haste. It was not miscalculation. It was theater. MacArthur had returned to the Philippines not as a commander completing an operation, but as a figure completing a narrative. He had promised to return. Now he was ensuring that promise would be seen, framed, and remembered. The image would reach Washington before casualty reports did. It would reach the public before after-action assessments. It would define the moment on his terms. In Washington, the photograph arrived exactly as intended. It showed resolve. It showed control. It showed inevitability. What it did not show were the aircraft pulled off mission, the infantry frozen in place, or the officers scrambling to prevent a disaster that had nothing to do with Japanese resistance. The decision had been made. The image existed, and with it, a line was crossed. The war would continue. The consequences would follow. But from that moment onward, one fact was no longer in doubt. Douglas MacArthur believed himself beyond restraint. In the autumn of 1944, the military situation in the Pacific offered multiple viable paths forward, each defined by logistics rather than heroics. The Japanese Empire was already strategically defeated. Its navy was shattered. Its air power was depleted. Its merchant fleet was collapsing under submarine attack. What remained was geography, distance, and time. From a purely military standpoint, the Philippines were no longer essential. American submarines had already severed Japan's access to oil from the Dutch East Indies. Japanese garrisons across the Pacific were isolated, undersupplied, and increasingly irrelevant. The United States no longer needed to retake every occupied territory to win the war. It needed bases close enough to Japan to apply sustained pressure until collapse became unavoidable. That opportunity already existed. Formosa, Okinawa, and the Ryukyus offered airfields within range of Japan itself. They could support strategic bombing, naval interdiction, and preparations for a final assault or negotiated surrender. Bypassing the Philippines would leave hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops stranded, unable to influence the outcome, consuming supplies that Japan could no longer replace. This was not theoretical. It had already worked elsewhere. The Central Pacific Campaign had proven the model. Islands were selected for utility, not symbolism. Strongholds were isolated rather than assaulted. Japanese forces were left to wither. American casualties were minimized by refusing to fight where fighting was unnecessary. Applying the same logic in late 1944 would have shortened the war. An advance through Formosa would have placed American air power astride Japan's remaining supply routes and created direct operational pressure on the home islands months earlier than a Philippine campaign allowed. It would have avoided large-scale amphibious operations against heavily populated terrain. It would have reduced the need for prolonged ground fighting in jungles, cities, and archipelagos that offered little strategic return. The naval calculus supported this approach. The Japanese combined fleet no longer posed a decisive threat. Fuel shortages had immobilized much of it. Any major fleet action would likely be a one-time, desperate engagement, not a sustained contest. American carrier aviation and submarine forces already dominated the seas. Control of the Philippines was no longer required to secure naval supremacy. Air power told the same story. Long-range bombers operating from forward bases could reach Japan without first retaking Manila. The Philippines added airfields, but they were not decisive airfields. They duplicated capabilities that could be achieved elsewhere with fewer troops and lower risk. Even the matter of prisoners and civilian populations, often cited later, did not change the military equation at the time. Liberation was a moral and political objective, not an operational necessity. Wars are not won by restoring territory already rendered strategically irrelevant. They are won by breaking the enemy's capacity to continue. At that moment, the enemy's capacity was already breaking. What remained was a choice between efficiency and symbolism, between acceleration and affirmation, between shortening the war and staging its narrative. The opportunity was real. It was measurable. It was supported by logistics, intelligence, and precedent. It did not require extraordinary risk. It required restraint. And restraint was exactly what the situation demanded. By 1944, MacArthur's assessments were not impulsive. They were deliberate, rehearsed, and built on years of preparation for a specific outcome. He had not simply positioned himself to return to the Philippines. He had constructed an argument that made his return appear inevitable. His credibility rested on familiarity. No American commander in the Pacific had spent more time in the Philippines. He knew the terrain, the ports, the airfields, and the political leadership. He had governed the islands before the war. He understood their symbolic value not only to Filipinos, but to the American public that remembered them as a U.S. possession lost under fire. MacArthur framed this knowledge as strategic foresight. In private memoranda and staff planning documents, he emphasized that the Philippines were not merely territory, but a hinge point. He argued that bypassing them would leave a hostile force astride key sea lanes, regardless of Japan's declining naval strength. He warned that abandoning the islands would complicate post-war stabilization, encourage insurgency, and undermine American credibility in Asia. These were not battlefield arguments. They were future-oriented, political military projections, and they were carefully chosen. MacArthur also prepared operationally. His headquarters produced detailed invasion plans months in advance, complete with logistics estimates, troop requirements, and timelines. These plans were polished, complete, and ready to execute. Alternatives were treated differently. Plans involving Formosa or other routes appeared less mature, more abstract, and often framed as risky or premature. This imbalance was not accidental. By presenting one option as executable and others as theoretical, MacArthur shaped how decision-makers perceived feasibility. Readiness became its own argument. A plan that existed in detail appeared safer than one that required further refinement, regardless of underlying logic. At the same time, MacArthur controlled information flow. He maintained close relationships with select journalists and editors who reliably echoed his framing. Stories emphasizing Filipino loyalty, American honor, and unfinished obligation appeared with regularity. These narratives were not rebutted by the military chain of command because they existed outside it. They were public, not professional. MacArthur understood that once an argument becomes public sentiment, it is no longer adjudicated on military grounds. He also managed expectations downward for alternatives. Bypassing the Philippines was described as callous, politically dangerous, and morally corrosive. The suffering of prisoners and civilians was highlighted, even though their liberation was not part of the immediate operational calculus. The implication was clear. Any leader who chose efficiency over obligation would be remembered as having abandoned American territory. This framing insulated MacArthur personally. If the Philippines were bypassed, responsibility would rest with Washington. If they were invaded, success would validate his judgment, and failure could be attributed to execution, not conception. Either outcome preserved his authority. His staff reinforced this posture. Dissenting views were marginalized. Naval concerns were acknowledged politely and then set aside. Joint planning meetings became exercises in managing resistance rather than integrating it. MacArthur did not argue aggressively. He outlasted opposition. This was preparation through persistence. Crucially, MacArthur never presented his case as defiance. He presented it as duty. He spoke of promises made, responsibilities inherited, and obligations deferred but not erased. The language avoided ego even as it protected it. He did not say he must return. He said America must. By the time senior leaders revisited the strategic choice, the ground had already shifted. One path carried political risk, moral accusation, and public backlash. The other carried familiarity, preparation, and applause. MacArthur had anticipated this moment. He had not prepared merely to execute an operation. He had prepared to make refusal impossible. The overrule did not arrive as a single command. It emerged through pressure, hesitation, and political arithmetic. By mid-1944, the formal military consensus had shifted away from MacArthur's preferred course. The Joint Chiefs of Staff viewed a bypass of the Philippines as the more efficient option. Naval leadership, in particular, saw little operational justification for committing vast ground forces to retake an archipelago already neutralized by blockade. From their perspective, the war could be accelerated by striking closer to Japan and avoiding a campaign whose primary value was symbolic. This consensus never became decisive authority. Franklin Roosevelt was not adjudicating between equal military arguments. He was balancing risks that extended far beyond the battlefield. The Philippines' decision had become entangled with an election year, a fragile coalition, and a general whose popularity could not be ignored. MacArthur understood this dynamic and exploited it without overt confrontation. He did not challenge the Joint Chiefs directly. He did not refuse orders. Instead, he allowed the disagreement to migrate out of the military system and into the political one. Public discourse began to frame the Philippines not as an operational choice, but as a test of national honor. Newspapers amplified the idea that abandoning the islands would mean abandoning American prisoners, Filipino allies, and a promise made under fire. This framing placed Roosevelt in a narrowing corridor. If he sided with the Joint Chiefs, he would appear to be overriding a beloved commander in favor of a colder, less visible strategy. If he disciplined MacArthur, he risked elevating him into a political martyr. Republican circles were already floating MacArthur's name as a potential challenger in the upcoming election. Conservative media treated him as a corrective to civilian caution. Roosevelt had seen this pattern before. He knew how quickly military figures could become political symbols. He also knew that wartime unity depended as much on perception as on planning. The institutional structure offered no clean solution. The American command system in the Pacific was divided by design. MacArthur did not report through a unified theater structure dominated by naval authority. His Southwest Pacific Area Command gave him operational autonomy and a direct line to Washington. This arrangement had been created to manage coalition sensitivities and service rivalries earlier in the war. Now it limited Roosevelt's leverage. Any attempt to curtail MacArthur would require a public confrontation or a quiet reassignment neither side was prepared to initiate. The Navy pressed its case forcefully but cautiously. Admirals argued in memoranda and closed meetings. They emphasized logistics, timelines, and casualties. What they could not provide was a political shield. Their arguments remained internal, professional, and abstract to the public. MacArthur's were not. When Roosevelt convened senior leaders to resolve the issue, the decision was already constrained. The Philippines option carried momentum, preparation, and public legitimacy. The alternative, though militarily sound, carried political ambiguity and the risk of backlash. Roosevelt chose containment over confrontation. He approved the Philippines campaign not because he believed it was the optimal military choice, but because rejecting it would create instability he could not control. He would manage MacArthur rather than break him. He would absorb the inefficiency rather than provoke a crisis of confidence. This was not indecision. It was calculation. The overrule was subtle but absolute. Naval objections were acknowledged and then sidelined. Strategic alternatives were deferred indefinitely. Resources flowed toward MacArthur's theater. Planning assumptions hardened into commitments. No written reprimand followed. No public rebuke was issued. MacArthur's behavior at Leyte, once reported, produced private anger but no formal response. The message was unmistakable. Fame insulated defiance. Within the command structure, the consequences were understood. Other commanders took note of what had happened and what had not. Authority was no longer enforced uniformly. It was negotiated, weighed against popularity and press coverage. Roosevelt believed he was buying time and unity. In doing so, he accepted a precedent. The system had intervened not to correct a breach of discipline, but to accommodate it. Political necessity had overridden institutional control. Military logic had been constrained by electoral reality. The decision to proceed through the Philippines was now irreversible. The costs would be paid later, in time, in resources, and in blood. But the deeper cost was already incurred. A commander had learned that if his position was strong enough, restraint no longer applied. The overrule did not silence MacArthur. It confirmed him. What followed unfolded exactly as the original decision had made inevitable. The invasion of the Philippines consumed time, shipping, and manpower on a scale that no longer matched Japan's strategic condition. Amphibious operations expanded across multiple islands. Urban fighting replaced maneuver. Supply lines lengthened. Casualty lists grew steadily, not because resistance was decisive, but because it was unnecessary. Each engagement was treated as validation rather than evidence. The Leyte landing became a media triumph. The image of MacArthur wading ashore eclipsed reports from the front. The narrative hardened quickly. The return had begun, and therefore the decision had been right. From that point on, reassessment was politically impossible. Adjustments were framed as refinements, never reversals. The Japanese responded predictably. They committed remaining naval forces in a single desperate attempt to disrupt the landings. The resulting battles destroyed what was left of Japan's fleet, but at the cost of further American losses that could have been avoided had the engagement never been provoked. This was treated as confirmation of strategic brilliance rather than proof that the enemy was already finished. The Philippines became a magnet for violence because they had been made a stage. Manila was not bypassed. It was assaulted. Street fighting reduced the city to ruins. Civilians died in numbers that shocked even seasoned observers. These deaths did not alter the course of the war. They did not accelerate Japan's defeat. They were a byproduct of choosing presence over pressure. Logistical strain followed. Shipping that could have supported operations closer to Japan was tied up moving men and material across an archipelago already neutralized by blockade. Air assets were dispersed rather than concentrated. Command attention fragmented. The tempo of the war slowed, not because resistance increased, but because the chosen path demanded it. None of this altered MacArthur's position. Success was defined narrowly as progress. Territory taken was equated with strategy accomplished. Each island secured became proof of momentum rather than a question of necessity. The absence of strategic recalibration was not accidental. It was required to preserve the legitimacy of the original choice. Inside the command structure, frustration mounted. Naval leaders watched resources diverted to objectives that no longer mattered. Joint planners noted delays accumulating elsewhere. But no one challenged the premise. The decision had been sanctified by public expectation and presidential approval. To question it was to question unity itself. The consequence extended beyond the Philippines. MacArthur's autonomy expanded with each unchallenged action. His command became increasingly insulated. Communications with Washington grew more performative than directive. Recommendations were framed as fait accompli. Objections arrived too late to matter. This pattern carried forward into the occupation of Japan. When the war ended, MacArthur emerged not merely as a victorious commander, but as a symbol of American authority in Asia. He governed Japan with minimal oversight, issuing directives with the confidence of someone who had never been meaningfully corrected. The habits formed during the Philippines campaign hardened into doctrine. The system had taught him what worked. Public narrative mattered more than internal discipline. Political calculation mattered more than operational efficiency. As long as outcomes could be framed as success, methods were irrelevant. The cost of this lesson would surface later. During the Korean War, MacArthur repeated the behavior that had gone unpunished before. He expanded objectives without authorization. He communicated through the press rather than the chain of command. He treated presidential guidance as negotiable, contingent on public support. He believed this because history had taught him so. When he had staged a landing under fire for the sake of an image, nothing had happened. When he had maneuvered politically to force a strategic decision, he had been rewarded. When he had diverted resources to satisfy narrative objectives, he had been celebrated. The Philippines campaign had not corrected him. It had confirmed him. The battlefield consequences of the original decision were measurable in casualties and delay. The institutional consequences were deeper. Civilian control had not been openly defied. It had been quietly eroded. By tolerating spectacle over discipline, the system had inverted its priorities. Authority became conditional. Obedience became optional for those who could command attention. The war was still won. That fact obscured the damage. Victory masked inefficiency. Success concealed distortion. The absence of catastrophe allowed precedent to settle unnoticed. But the consequences did not disappear. They accumulated. Every mile fought through the Philippines instead of bypassed represented time added to the war. Every life lost in operations chosen for symbolism rather than necessity traced back to a decision made under political pressure. Every later act of insubordination rested on the memory of earlier indulgence. The consequence was not a single disaster. It was a pattern. A commander learned that he could bend strategy without consequence. A president learned that restraint was safer than confrontation. An institution learned to accommodate rather than enforce. The battlefield recorded the immediate costs. History recorded the longer ones. The decision made in 1944 did not fail tactically. It succeeded on its own terms. That was precisely the problem. Because success, once defined by narrative instead of necessity, ceases to impose limits. And limits, once removed, do not return on their own. The post-war record removed any ambiguity that the war itself had concealed. Once fighting ended, the internal correspondence began to surface. Memoranda written during the war, diaries kept by senior officials, and later testimony all pointed to the same conclusion. MacArthur's latitude had not been accidental. It had been tolerated knowingly, repeatedly, and with increasing resignation. Franklin Roosevelt never disputed the facts of Leyte. Privately, he was furious. His staff recorded his anger clearly. The issue was never whether MacArthur had overstepped. It was whether disciplining him was worth the cost. Each time the answer was the same. No action. Admiral William Leahy, Roosevelt's closest military advisor, later described MacArthur as a commander who consistently operated outside normal constraints. Leahy did not portray this as ignorance. He portrayed it as calculation on both sides. MacArthur pushed because he could. Roosevelt yielded because he believed he had no alternative that would not fracture public support. This pattern hardened during the occupation of Japan. MacArthur exercised near-sovereign authority. He issued directives without prior approval. He controlled information flow to Washington. Reports were delayed, filtered, or framed to support his preferred narrative. Civilian officials who attempted to assert oversight found themselves managing optics rather than policy. No corrective mechanism emerged. Congress did not intervene. The public viewed MacArthur as the architect of victory and reconstruction. The White House, transitioning from Roosevelt to Truman, inherited not just a general, but an expectation. MacArthur was not treated as a subordinate. He was treated as a fixture. The Korean War exposed the consequences of that inheritance. MacArthur's communications during the conflict followed the same pattern established years earlier. He publicly challenged administration policy. He proposed escalations without authorization. He corresponded directly with foreign leaders. He framed disagreement as weakness and restraint as betrayal. This time, the record shows something different. President Harry Truman documented his reasoning carefully. He consulted advisors. He reviewed precedents. He examined exactly how MacArthur had been handled under Roosevelt. The conclusion was blunt. Tolerance had created the problem. Avoidance had deferred it. When Truman dismissed MacArthur in April 1951, the political backlash was immediate and severe. Truman's approval ratings collapsed. MacArthur returned to the United States to cheering crowds and congressional applause. On the surface, it appeared Truman had proven Roosevelt's caution correct. The long-term record says otherwise. Subsequent assessments by military historians, civilian officials, and later presidents consistently treated Truman's decision as necessary. The principle of civilian control had been restored not because it was popular, but because it had been violated too long. MacArthur's own testimony before Congress revealed the depth of his conviction. He did not argue that he had misunderstood orders. He argued that his judgment should have prevailed. He spoke as someone accustomed to accommodation, not correction. That expectation had been formed years earlier. Declassified Joint Chiefs documents confirm that senior officers understood the danger during the war. They spoke of MacArthur as exceptional not in talent, but in manageability. They noted that normal disciplinary tools no longer applied. They adapted by working around him rather than through him. This adaptation became institutional habit. The post-war U.S. military reorganized command structures explicitly to prevent similar concentrations of autonomy. Unified commands were tightened. Civilian oversight mechanisms were reinforced. Public communication by serving officers was constrained more strictly. These reforms were reactions, not abstractions. They were responses to a specific case that had exposed a vulnerability. The vulnerability was not MacArthur's ego. It was a system that had chosen expedience over enforcement. Roosevelt's own legacy absorbed the contradiction. He is remembered as a master political manager who held together an unprecedented coalition and won a global war. He is also remembered, in quieter assessments, as the president who allowed a general to operate beyond civilian restraint because confronting him was inconvenient. Both assessments are accurate. The post-war record does not ask whether Roosevelt should have acted differently. It documents that he understood the risk and accepted it. It records that MacArthur recognized this acceptance and expanded into it. It shows that the war's success delayed accountability but did not erase the underlying failure. By the time the full documentation became available, the pattern was undeniable. MacArthur had not misjudged his position. He had read it correctly. He was untouchable only as long as the system chose not to touch him. The case closes with clarity. Douglas MacArthur was not removed because he failed. He was removed because the system finally enforced a rule it had long suspended. The rule was simple. Military authority ends where civilian authority begins. For nearly a decade, that boundary had been blurred. Not accidentally, not unknowingly. It had been eroded through calculation. Each time confrontation was avoided, the imbalance deepened. Each time spectacle replaced discipline, precedent hardened. Franklin Roosevelt believed he was managing a liability. He believed indulgence was temporary and control remained intact. The record shows otherwise. By refusing to impose limits when they mattered, he taught MacArthur that limits were conditional. Harry Truman faced the accumulated result. When Truman dismissed MacArthur, he absorbed the political damage Roosevelt had feared. He accepted the cost rather than defer it again. Public opinion turned. Approval collapsed. Parades were held for the dismissed general, not the president who dismissed him. But the system held. MacArthur never commanded again. The principle was reasserted. Civilian control survived not because it was popular, but because it was enforced at last. This was not a morality play. It was an accounting. MacArthur was competent. He was effective. He was also dangerous when unchecked. His belief that he was untouchable was not delusion. It was learned behavior, reinforced by years of tolerance. Roosevelt did not create MacArthur's ego. He accommodated it. Truman did not destroy a hero. He ended an exception. The war's outcome does not absolve the process that produced it. Victory does not retroactively validate every decision made along the way. Some costs are institutional. They appear later. They demand payment eventually. This case ends without ambiguity. When discipline becomes negotiable, authority becomes performative. When authority becomes performative, command fractures. And when command fractures, correction arrives only after damage is done. Douglas MacArthur did not fall from grace. He reached the limit that should have been enforced long before. The record is complete. If you want more closed-case analyses of power, command, and consequence, subscribe to the channel and leave your perspective in the comments.